Eddie Hearn losing purse bids has been kind of a running joke in boxing over the past few years. Even when Eddie Hearn is on the A side of the bid, so when he's the promoter of the champion or whatever the case may be, he still loses loads of purse bids. An example would be when a final eliminator was ordered a couple years back between Joshua Buatsi and Jean Pascal. You guys remember that? That's when Buatsi was still signed to Eddie Hearn. The purse split was 60-40 in Buatsi's favor. So Eddie Hearn was at an advantage bidding. But guess what? He still lost the purse bid. Some promoters, like Frank Warren, for example, will often overbid for fights, even when they're the B side, just to get an advantage for their fighter. They see it as a long-term investment. In boxing, sometimes you're dealing with small margins. And Frank Warren's philosophy for the longest time has been to get his fighter every advantage possible, to give him that extra 1 or 2% that may allow him to win the fight. Whereas with Eddie Hearn, he doesn't have that philosophy. If they've paid a lot of money to sign a fighter who's just turned pro, they want to get him to a high-profile fight as quickly as possible so they can start recouping that money and making profit. And you can understand that from a business perspective, but that isn't always what's best for the fighter in terms of their development. You end up fast-tracking fighters, and by the time they get to their big fight, they're not ready. You haven't developed them properly. And again, going back to purse bids, Frank Warren often wins bids when he's promoting a challenger, and Eddie Hearn will lose bids when he's promoting the A-side or a champion. I'm not saying he always loses bids when he promotes a champion, but he has done in many cases. And as I said, it comes down to the business philosophy, if you like. And Frank Warren's business philosophy is a bit different. He thinks more long-term. That's why he likes to sign these really long-term deals. I mean, Daniel Dubois, what was he on, a 5-year deal? Many of his fighters are on these really, really long deals. Whereas Eddie Hearn likes to do shorter deals. There are some exceptions, of course, but generally Eddie likes to do short deals because a short deal means he's not going to have to invest as much. If you sign a fighter to a 5-year deal, you've got to provide him fights for those 5 years. You got to be paying him purses for 5 years. And what if his fights don't sell? What if he doesn't become very successful? You still got to keep giving him fights and paying him. So I understand both sides of the equation. But from the perspective of a fighter, unless you're really experienced in the amateurs like a Lomachenko or Beterbiev, somebody like that, then you're not going to want to get fast-tracked if you know what you're doing. I mean, some fighters might, because they're just very greedy. But if you're sensible and you got sensible people around you, you're going to want to take your time and move at the correct pace. And what the correct pace is depends on how quickly you develop. Not all fighters develop at the same speed. You look at a young Mike Tyson on the way up, he developed very quickly as an amateur and as a pro. Obviously, they gave him a lot of fights in the pros. I think he was nearly 30 fights in by the time he challenged for the world title against Trevor Berbick, despite having only been pro for about 2 years. So maybe 28 fights, something like that in the space of 2 years, which is an enormous amount. Most of them were against put-ins, but there was a few sterner tests thrown in there as well. But point being, fighters develop at different rates. And that's the art of being a promoter, a manager, etc., is recognizing exactly where your fighter's at, what he needs, how fast he can be moved, and so on. I think one fighter that Eddie Hearn was doing a really good job with, bringing him on at the perfect pace, was Conor Benn, up until that Eubank debacle. I really couldn't fault the way Conor Benn had been developed up until that point. They didn't just give him a load of pies who he could knock over in one round. They tested him along the way. They stepped him up gradually. When he had that life and death battle with the Frenchman Payno, a couple fights later, they put him back in with that same guy to see how far Conor Benn had progressed. And he dealt with him much easier second time around. He eventually had him fighting people like Chris Algieri and Chris Van Heerden and so on. So I thought they were doing a fantastic job developing him as a fighter. They should have stayed on that same trajectory, but I spoke about greed earlier on. Greed got the better of certainly Eddie Hearn, Conor Benn as well. And I'm sure DAZN had a lot to do with it because of the fact that they lost the Usyk-AJ rematch to Sky after AJ had already signed with them, with DAZN that is. AJ ended up losing that fight, coming back to DAZN beltless. So surely DAZN would have been pressuring Hearn. Get us a big fight, get us a pay-per-view. I don't care who it is. And Hearn tries to make this strange matchup between Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. One of them's a middleweight contender coming to the end of his career who's just looking for one last title shot at 160. The other one's a young up-and-coming welterweight who's on the verge of title eliminator and world title challenges. Yet they divert from that path to go fight this middleweight. I just didn't understand it at the time. I thought it was weird. In Hinduism, there's the concept of dharma. I'm not a Hindu, not a religious person, but I've looked into some of the concepts in Hinduism, and there are different definitions, as I understand it, of Dharma. But one interpretation of it is Dharma is your calling, is the path in life that you're supposed to be on in accordance with your abilities and talents. Up until that Eubank Jr. fight, Conor Benn, in a boxing sense, was following his Dharma, as far as I could tell. And the idea is when you follow your Dharma, things generally work out for the best. When you deviate from it, that's when you run into problems. And that's what happened with that Eubank Jr. thing. Conor Benn deviated from his Dharma, and it all went Pete Tong. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Just thought I'd explain a little bit about the different business philosophies between the likes of Frank Warren and the likes of Eddie Hearn. Maybe Eddie Hearn's philosophy is better for making a profit, at least in the short term. But in the long term, if your fighters have been developed better, maybe that's the better way to do it from a business perspective. Maybe you'll get more mileage out of your fighters if you do it that way. Obviously, it's going to be hit and miss. That's the thing, because you're not going to get it right with every fighter, investing in them long term in that way. With some of them, it will pay off. With others, going to waste a lot of money. So I'll leave it there. Are you sick and tired of the mainstream mindset? Does the dogmatic conformity and pathological ignorance have you tearing your hair out in frustration? Then don't be alone. Come and join our brotherhood on Patreon. We stand as a beacon of reason against an army of insanity. You'll gain access to my weekly topical podcast where we take more deep dives than Jacques Cousteau on an endless variety of subjects. There's also videos, interviews, live Q&As, as well as a vast back catalogue of previous episodes, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen via the Patreon app or download in high-quality MP3. Connect with myself and hundreds of other members in our Element chat group. There's no contract, no commitment, you can cancel at any time, and it's cheaper than a Mickey D's McMuffin. Just head to my Patreon page via the link below this video and select the tier called the Brotherhood of Reason. I'll see you over there.